All right, so I have just downloaded Blender version 3.1. That's the latest version as I'm recording this, and they kind of release new updates all the time. If you have a slightly different version, I wouldn't worry too much about it, as long as it's later than, I think, 2.7 is when they really made a big change and changed the whole layout. But anything after 2.7 should be generally similar, and it should be good. But I tend to always download the new version just to kind of keep updated with what they've changed. So this is the menu you should see when you first open things up. And before you do anything, I suggest we're going to stick with select with the left. And this is kind of telling you or giving you an option to, make your UI work a little bit differently. But we're going to keep that. But we are going to click with spacebar hotkey. I prefer using that for search. And instead of play. So play means if you're doing an animation, right, you'll hit spacebar to run the animation and make it play. But generally speaking, I don't do too much animating in Blender, and I find search to be super helpful. So I recommend doing that, especially for beginners as well. Theme Blender Dark, that all sounds pretty good. So I'm just going to click out of this box now, and it'll disappear. And this is what you get when you first open up Blender. And we're going to go over just a general overview of the whole thing here. So first things first, a little bit of navigating in the viewport. That's this main area here. The middle mouse button on your mouse there will, if you click and drag, you'll be able to rotate around. If you hold Alt and click with the middle mouse button, you'll snap to an orthographic view. Okay, so that's similar if you looked at the 3D code section with the shift in 3D code, but for here it's Alt and middle mouse. Middle mouse and shift will pan your canvas around. Okay, and what else? That's pretty much the basics. If you move too far away from your cube and you're kind of rotating around a different area, that happens quite often. You kind of get lost in the viewport here. All you have to do is select the where you've been working or some objects that you've been working in, and there's a few ways to kind of get back to it over there. But the way I prefer is by hitting the tilde key, which is the little squiggly line just the left of the number 1 on your keyboard. And that will bring up this pie menu. And that's, for me personally, that's my favorite way to navigate Blender, is with this pie menu. And there's a lot you can do with it. You can see all the options here. But all you have to do to select one of these options, you don't actually have to click anything. You just hold the tilde key. And then in this case, I'm going to hover over towards the View Selected button. And I don't have to click, I just have to let go of the tilde key, and it'll work. And in that case, we chose the View Selected, and it brought us to the cube, which we've selected in the layers. Okay, so it's kind of a lot to deal with, but there's some other options all within that tilde pie menu. And this is my actually preferred way to go into orthographic views as well. I hold the tilde key and I hover over one of these orthographic modes, front, back, and I just let go of the tilde key. So it kind of actually takes a little bit of practice to become comfortable with that, but I find it ends up being very fast. Oh, and then of course you can scroll with the middle mouse button to zoom in and out as well. Okay, so spend a little bit of time getting comfortable with that. And there's other ways to use these menus. You can see those little numbers there correspond with the number on the numpad. And some people do that in Blender, but I prefer just using the pie menu for everything. I find it just a little bit faster. All right, so that's kind of generally how you navigate things. Just to go over some of this other areas real quick. So we are currently in the Layout tab here, okay? And that's sort of the mode of Blender that sort of is the basic version of Blender. And if you want to do something very specific, you can click on one of these other tabs and it'll change the layout a little bit based on what those tabs do. Okay. For the most part in this tutorial, we're going to stick with layout. We'll do a little bit on the shading later, and we might do a little bit of UV editing, and that's pretty much it. We're not going to worry too much about all these other tabs. But of course, I highly recommend looking into them and learning more about it. So over here on the right, this is your layers in your scene. That's your collection. And these menus over here are kind of a variety of important menus. When you click on these tiny little icons, they all do something different. And we're going to only kind of go over them as needed because they're all kind of complicated, and you can scroll down and there's like 100 different menu items here. Primarily, we're probably going to stick with this top one, which is the rendering menu, and the one right below that, that's some more information for like when you do a camera render, sort of like you can see there's like a little icon of a printout there. So it's sort of what you need to get a nice render. So those top two we're going to use quite a bit, and then probably all the way down on this list. Well, first of all, this wrench is the modifier menu. We're definitely going to be using that, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then also, second from the bottom here, this one is the materials, and we'll definitely be using that as well. So that's a little bit of information there. All the way over here on the left, these are some different ways you can use your select tool. So right now, this is blue because we're on the square select. So if you just click and drag, you'll see you can get like a nice box select, and you can select multiple objects that way. If you click and hold on that menu, on that little select box, you can actually do some different options for selecting. But I tend to, the lasso can be useful. That's like in Photoshop, you can make a lasso and get an odd shape of selection and select everything within that. But generally speaking, I just stick with select box. And these other ones are useful if you're coming from another 3D program. This is sort of a good way to kind of bridge the gap between the way other 3D programs and the way Blender works. But for me, I actually don't use too much of this, and I'll explain why in a second. But generally speaking, we're not going to talk too much about that. We're going to use all the hotkeys that we can in Blender and kind of use it to the best of its ability. So let's get into a little bit more tools and how you move things around. All right, so let's talk about moving things around in Blender. We're just going to do that on this default cube here that Blender always starts out with. And this is going to be a little bit hotkey heavy. So, you know, you can actually use these other menus here to do this. You can click this, for example, and you get that little widget. You can move things around that way, just like in 3D Code. But I actually don't use that at all. I'm going to go back to the select option, and Blender has, I think, a really amazing and fast way to move things around. And let's talk about what that is. So the hotkey to move is G, and it works actually just like we talked about in 3D Code, where you don't actually have to click yet. You just hit the letter G, you move your mouse around, and then you click to accept the move. So that finishes the movement, okay? But we moved it kind of in 3D space, so it kind of went all over the place. We couldn't really estimate where it was going to end up. So I'm going to Control Z that back. And what you can do is you hit the letter G and then hold the middle mouse button, and that snaps it to an axis. And it kind of snaps it, it guesses which axis you want to move it on, the X, the Y, or the Z, based on how close you are sort of to that axis. And that will also change quite a bit based on how you're rotated. So if I wanted to move on this red axis here, This is sort of a weird angle to do that on because it doesn't know whether I want to go on the X or the Z axis. So what I would probably want to do is rotate over here and now hit the G key and the middle mouse button. And you can see it's much easier. It knows that I want to go on the red axis. And then when you're happy with the placement, you actually have to click with the left mouse button to accept the movement, just like before. So that snapping to the axis is going to be very important. I find it to be a very fast way to do things. You can also, there's another way to do it though, if you don't like that, and that's you hit the letter G to move. Then you hit the letter of the axis you want it to move on. So let's say I hit the X axis, then it'll snap to that red X axis there, and then I click to accept the change, or I could hit G, then Y, click to accept the change, or G and Z. And Z is up and down in Blender, which is different than a lot of 3D programs actually, where Y is up and down. I'm not sure why that is, but it takes a little bit of getting used to if you're coming from another program. So this method of clicking to accept a change is going to be all over Blender, and it applies also to some of the other simple operations. Let's talk about scale. That's the letter S, and then you move your mouse back and forth to scale up or down, and then you click to accept a change. And I find that to be very, very fast. And I'm going to Control Z that back, and just word of warning on that. If you are very, very close to your object, close to the center of it, and you hit S, it can be a little tricky. You might accidentally move it like too far or cross over the middle. So I hit escape to, by the way, to cancel that. You can hit escape rather than clicking, and that'll cancel the change. So just to finish that thought, I would kind of keep your mouse a little bit further away from the object and hit S to scale, and then it'll be a little bit easier to control. And then the last main change here is the scale along an axis option, and that is also S, but then instead of moving like what we did before, we're going to hit the middle mouse button and hold it, and then that snaps it to an axis. So now it's letting us scale along one axis only. And again, it might be confused about which axis you want, so it helps to kind of rotate and a little bit to sort of help it decide which axis. And this, you can also, instead of using the middle mouse to snap to an axis, you can also hit the letter of the axis that you want. So first S, then Y, and now it knows that we want to go along the Y axis. Or first S, then X, first S, then Z, right? So those are some of the most simple ways to do it. Now, very often, instead of snapping with the middle mouse to an axis, I'll actually just go into orthographic mode first in the top view using the pie menu there. And now I think it's a little bit easier. I still have to hold the middle mouse if I want to snap it to an axis, but there's only two that it's choosing from because we're in the top view. So it's a little bit easier for it to guess which axis we want it to move. And I'll hit escape to cancel that. And then if you want to rotate an object, we're going to go into top view to sort of show this. That's just the letter R, and that works similar to the other ones where you rotate by moving your mouse and then you click to accept a change. And for this one in particular, I think it's kind of important to keep your mouse a little bit away from the object when you do it, because if you're too close, it'll move too quickly and it'll be a little bit hard to control. So keep your mouse a little bit away, rotate, and click to accept a change. All right, next we're going to talk about some absolute basic modeling tools. Once again, we're not going to dive too deeply into modeling, but I think it's important to at least understand a little bit just so that you can later keep learning about it. So the first thing you need to know is that there's a very important hotkey in Blender, and that's the tab button. And the tab switches you between object mode and edit mode. And you can see that changing up here. Be careful though, if you aren't hovering with your mouse over the viewport, that won't change. You can see if I hover over the layers, for example, and hit tab, nothing happens. But if I hover over here in the viewport, anywhere in the viewport, it will switch our currently selected object into edit mode. And what edit mode is it's the mode that you need to be in when you're making changes to a specific object, right? So I'm going to hit the hotkey Shift D, and that's duplicate. And I'll create another cube over here just to show you what's going on. And if I select this cube and hit tab, we can see that one has switched over to edit mode, and we can see that because it's got an orange overlay and it's got these vertex points that we can edit. But this cube over here is the first one is not in edit mode. So edit mode is object specific. I have to hit tab again to switch back to object mode, and then select this one if I want to make changes to it. And then I can go into edit mode on that specific object. Okay. So if you're in edit mode, there's some more hotkeys that we need to talk about, and that's the letter the number 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that changing up here. You can also just click these little options to switch back and forth, or you can hit the number 1, 2, and 3 to switch back and forth. And what that is face mode, that's this one, or the number 3. Edge mode, that's this one, or the number 2. And vertex mode, and that's this one, or the number 1. And let's just talk about face mode for a second. So if you're familiar at all with traditional 3D programs like this, there's 3 pieces that make up objects. That's faces, edges, and vertexes. So a face is this side of it here. An edge, and that's made of 4 edges. That's these 1, 2, 3, 4 edges there. And then those edges are made up of these little points or vertexes. 1, 2, 3, 4 points, right? So if we wanted to make a change to this box, if we wanted to start out by sculpting, or we're not really sculpting, we're box modeling now. Let's just see what happens if we click face mode, click this face, which we're selected on. And if I hit the letter G key, we can move around just that face. And all this is possible, again, just because we're in edit mode and not object mode, right? So it works just the operations to move parts of it around work just the same as object mode. So I can click to accept the change. We can hit S to scale that, and it'll move just that face. Click to accept the change. Or we can hit R and just rotate just that object, or just that face, rather. You can also hit escape to cancel it. So if I were to hit the number 2, it would switch over to edge mode, and it'll select all the edges that made up that face automatically. If I only want one of them, I have to go in and click it. And now the same operations apply: G to move, S to scale, R to rotate. And finally, you can also do that with, if you hit the number 1 or click this vertex mode, select one of these vertexes, and you can just edit that point individually. S won't really work with that because you can't scale vertexes, but R similarly won't really work, but G for sure will move it around. There's a caveat to that though, and that is if you select 2 different points, you actually can scale them in relation to each other. So they scale, away from a single point in the middle between them. And the same, I believe, for R, yeah, you can rotate around a single point. So that's just a little bit about the way faces, edges, and vertexes work in Blender. All right, and the only real modeling tools that we're going to talk about right now are Inset and Extrude. So let's just show you what those do. So if I'm selected on this cube, I'll hit Tab to go into edit mode. I'll hit 3 to go into face mode, then select a face. And Inset and Extrude work together, and they're very similar. So I'll just show you what they do. So the letter I is the hotkey for Inset, and that will inset this square and create another square inside it, and it'll slide along the face there. And we're going to move it in a little bit and click to accept the change. And we'll see that we've inset another square in there. And then if we hit the letter E, that's extrude, and it'll push a piece out. You can also go in with extrude, and then you click to accept the change. So very often when you're box modeling, you'll be using inset and then extrude kind of together. You can mess around with that. And when you hit extrude, it will extrude along a certain axis, right? So this face was facing upward, so it's going to extrude along that face. If I select this face over here and hit extrude, it'll extrude along that face. So get used to inset and extrude. If you want to learn more about it, you can look up, there's a lot of modeling tutorials out there, but I just wanted to make you aware of those just because they are so common. So just a quick word on selecting parts of an object that I think you should be aware of. Let's go into edit mode by hitting tab, and we're currently in face mode, so let's stick with that. I'll just select one face. So if you hold shift and then click another face, you select that one as well. If you hold shift, you can select another one. If you want to deselect, you can hold control, and I usually make a little box to indicate that I want to deselect that, and that's a quick way of doing it. If you want to select a loop around an object, you can actually hold the Alt key and hover in between two different faces and click, and it will select all the way around in that loop. Another quick modeling tool that we should talk about is Control R is a loop cut. What that does is it creates this yellow line here, and if we click to accept that, we are allowed to sort of slide that up and down and decide where we want that loop cut. Then we click again to accept that placement. And now we've added another cut in this box. So now if we go to face mode and click this face, it only selects this section, and then we would have to select that as another section. So very often you're going to be using Control R. Another trick with Control R is if you hit Control R and then use the scroll wheel upwards, you can add more cuts, and they're spaced evenly. You can scroll up or down to decide how many cuts you want to make. Then you click to accept that change. Then you can actually move, it allows you to slide them up or down one more time. Well, you can right click to cancel that so they'll place perfectly. Or you can, slide them a little bit up. Click to place, slide them a little bit up or down, then click again to accept that placement. One more tip, if you hit Control R to make a cut and then click and move it around, and then click to accept that move, and then you want to change it later, you're not quite happy with that placement. First of all, you need to select the edge you want to change. So I'm going to hit Alt, click, and that'll select the whole loop of that edge all the way around. And then you can just double tap G, the letter G, and that will slide the edges along the mesh. And then you click to accept the change. So you can edit that placement later. If you want to delete parts of your mesh, there's a few options actually. So if I were to just select this one edge right here and hit the delete key, we'd get this menu option. And it's asking you what exactly you want to delete. So we could delete the edges that we've selected, or the vertices that we've selected, the edges we've selected, the face, etc. And then there's also this dissolve options. So what delete would do in this case, if I go ahead and delete this edge, it'll delete that edge and everything that leads up to it. So we actually deleted this whole face as part of that. So I'll Control Z that. Versus if I hit the delete key and just click dissolve edges, it'll dissolve the edge in that face, but not delete the face itself. So you want to kind of get used to that, and if you're, depending on what you're deleting and how you want it to go, you might select delete or dissolve. All right, I just want to briefly touch on how separating certain parts of a mesh works, joining them together, and getting a little bit used to that kind of a workflow. So right now we have an object with just a cube in it. And if I go into edit mode and I'll shift D the faces themselves, we'll create another cube over here, but it's still within that first object because we didn't duplicate the object, we just duplicated the faces within it. So you'll see if I go back to object mode and select away and select back, these two cubes are still in the same object together. Now, if we let's say we changed our minds on that and we wanted them to be two separate objects so that we could sort of navigate them differently. We would go into tab, and Blender remembers what faces you had selected previously, so that's why this part is selected. If I select anywhere, we can deselect that. And let's say we wanted to make this cube its own object again. All we would have to do is hover over that part of the mesh and hit the letter L key. And that's the hotkey in Blender for selecting everything that's linked in the same part of the mesh. So even though these are the same object, they're still somewhat separated, right? And so the letter L will select everything that's in that sort of segment. So let's say we do that, and I'll select everything there. And now we have to hit the letter P to separate it. And you get this little kind of menu here when you hit P. And I'm just going to click on selection because we're separating by selection. And you'll see right away we got now 2 cubes in the layer stack. And if I go back to object mode, and you'll see when I select one versus the other, they're completely separate now. So that'll come up quite a bit when we want to separate parts of our mesh that we import from 3D Code. So definitely want to make you aware of the L and P hotkeys. And now that we've separated these 2 cubes into different objects, let's say we change our mind and we want them to be grouped together in the same object. I'm just going to select them both by holding Shift. Then the hotkey is Control-J. You'll see it group them together into one single object, and if we go into edit mode, all of these faces are within the same object. All right, let's talk about adding in new objects and meshes. So I've gone ahead and deleted the whole cube that we started with, and the hotkey for adding in new things is Shift-A, and that'll bring up this menu here, and there's a huge list of things you can add into your scene. For now, we're going to hover on Mesh, and then hover over here and select Cube again, and we get it back. That will, if we hit Shift-A again and go to Cube, we can place another one. It's placed in exactly the same spot, so if I move it over here, we'll see that there were 2. And every time you do go ahead and place something, it will place it where the 3D cursor is, which is in this case is right on the world origin. And we'll talk about the 3D cursor in a second, but real quick, just so you know, if you hold Shift and right click, it'll move it over there, wherever you have placed your cursor. And then now if we go ahead and place another cube, we'll see that it placed right there. So in a second, we'll talk about some of these other options for placing stuff in your scene, but I just want you to be aware of the Shift-A hotkey. All right, so let's talk for a second about organizing things into groups. In Blender, actually, they're called collections. And by default, this is the scene that will come up, and we have a cube in there, got a default point light in there, and a default camera. And it's all inside this one collection, okay? So if we wanted to group things a little bit differently, let's say we have hitting Shift-D to make some extra cubes just so that we have something to organize. Let's say we want all our cubes in one group and everything else in its own separate group. So what I would do is go over here and I'll hold Shift to select all those cubes there. And we are going to hover inside the Layers panel and hit the letter M for Move. And you get this menu here, and all we need to do is click New Collection. And the next thing that comes up is an option to title the new collection. So we're going to call it Cubes. And I'll hit Enter to accept. And now you can see we've created this new collection right here. It's called Cubes. And it's moved everything that we selected out of the old collection. So and let's try that with the camera as well. I'll select the camera. I can select it here or in here. And hit M and click New Collection, and we'll call that Camera. And now we have a third collection for Camera. And then lastly, this light was in the original collection. I guess we don't need to move it into a new one, but we'll just double click this original collection and rename it Lights. Okay, so you can furl and unfurl these to expand and show everything that's in them. But for now, you can see we've organize everything quite nicely. But if we did want to, if we wanted to, for some reason, move one collection inside of another, you would just click and drag, just like in Photoshop, and let go onto the new group, or the old group, I guess. And if I unfurl that, we'll see that there's a collection inside there called camera, and I can unfurl that to show the objects. So I recommend just getting used to the M hotkey to move things around. And it doesn't just create new collections, by the way. Let's say I wanted to move the light into the cubes collection. I could just click the light, hit M, and then I'll just hover down here at the collections we've already created, and then select the collection we want to move it to. In this case, there's 2 in there, so I have to decide which one I want to move it to. And there we go. So it's actually quite intuitive once you get used to it. And there's actually nothing in this collection now because we moved the light out of it, so I'll just go ahead and delete it. One more modeling tool you need to be aware of is the Bevel tool. And I'll just show you what that is right here. So if I select this and I hit Tab to go into edit mode, and I'll hit 2 to go into edge mode, and just select one single edge here. And then if I hit Control B, that's the hotkey for bevel, and then move my mouse, and you'll see we're making a bevel in that edge that we selected. So you can move it around to decide, how much of a cut you want it to be. And then before you click to accept, you can actually use the scroll wheel on your mouse. And every time you scroll up, it'll add another segment there. So it'll get rounder and rounder, basically. Or you can scroll back down to decide how many segments you want to apply. So super useful, very, very common modeling tool. It'll come up quite a bit, I think, if you try to model anything in Blender. So we'll click to accept. And then before you do anything else, you can actually go down here and unfurl this little bevel menu for more options. And this is a common thing in Blender where after you do an action, you can go down here and open up another little menu just to adjust it a little bit further. So you can mess with the sliders here. You can continue to add more segments, actually, even though you already clicked to select it or to accept it. You can mess with the shape of it a little bit. You can go through all these and see what they all do, but just wanted you to be aware of that. And if I do go ahead and select something else, that menu will disappear. So you kind of get your one little extra chance there to make changes. So a couple more little tricks about the Bevel tool that you should be aware of. Let's click on a cube and go to edit mode. And I'm going to go into edge mode, and I'll hit Control B. And since we have all the edges selected, oops, try that again. Have all the edges selected, it'll bevel all the edges at once. So I'll scroll my mouse wheel down a little bit just so that it's not quite so many edges. Click to accept, and I'll hit Tab. And we can see that it's very segmented and sort of blocky there with the geometry because we only have so many little edges that we added. So you don't necessarily have to add 100 of them just for it to be very smooth. Because all you have to do is now you can right click and click Shade Smooth right here. And you'll see right away that it's much better looking. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the 3D cursor and origins in Blender, which is going to come up quite a bit in the next section. It's kind of important for mirroring and using modifiers. So let's get used to it a little bit. So I've moved this cube from where it placed right there, just a little bit off to the side. And you can see that we've separated the origin of the object itself, which is that little orange dot, and then the 3D cursor, which is this widget here. And those two things act together, and they kind of are going to be important. So let's talk about it. So if I go into top view and I rotate, this object will rotate around the center of itself because the origin of that object is by default set to the middle of it. Okay. So if I hit the space bar, and remember way back in the beginning when we set up Blender, we set the hotkey for spacebar to be search. And what that does is it searches everything within Blender, and it's a kind of a quick way to make changes without finding the exact place in all the windows up here. So I'm going to hit space, and I'm going to just type set origin, and it's giving me all these options right here. and I'm just going to click Set Origin to 3D Cursor. And you can see that little orange dot disappeared from there and went to the 3D cursor, which right now is right here. So now if I hit R and rotate this cube, it'll rotate around that origin, which is now where the 3D cursor is. Okay, so I'll hit escape to cancel that. If I want to, I can hit spacebar, type set origin, and click back to center of mass, and it'll jump back to the center of the cube, and now it rotates around itself again. So I do that spacebar set origin trick quite a bit, depending on where I want the origin of an object to be. We can actually move the 3D cursor though, and all you have to do is hit Shift, right click anywhere, and that'll move the 3D cursor. And then if we set origin to 3D cursor, you can see it'll now rotate around that spot. So that's kind of the power of the 3D cursor, and you can do that from any angle, right? Shift, right click. Normally you would want to do that in an orthographic view because then you know exactly where it's going. If you want the 3D cursor to get back to the world origin though, all you have to do is hit Shift S, and you get this pie menu, and there's quite a few options here, and they're all pretty self-explanatory. But the one I was talking about is cursor to world origin, and you can see it jumped right back to the center of our scene. Some of the other useful ones would be cursor to selected. It'll jump the cursor to the origin of the object, which in this case we place way over here. Cursor to active, that'll do the same thing in this case because the active object's origin is right here. And yeah, that's probably the ones you need to know. Selection to cursor will, in this case, it didn't do anything because the origin of the object is already where the cursor is. But let's say I hit spacebar, set origin to geometry. We're going to jump that orange dot back to the middle of its object, right? And then now I'll hit Shift S, and we'll see what selection to cursor does. It'll move the origin of that object to wherever we've placed the cursor, the 3D cursor. And in this case, we had it way over here. So those are some hotkeys and navigational tools I highly recommend getting used to. When we get into mirroring with symmetry, the origin of the object is going to matter a lot where it's placed. And the best way to move the origin of an object is with that 3D cursor that we talked about. So just wanted to make you aware of those steps, and when we actually do it with our architecture, I'll go over those steps again, but I just want you to have a basic understanding of how those work. Another couple of navigational hotkeys you need to be aware of are the period hotkey, which brings up this pie menu, the pivot point, and the comma, which brings up this pie menu. And I'm just going to briefly talk about them for a second. So if you hit the comma, this is the orientation of our current active object. So let's select it, and right now it's on normal. And what that means is, if let's say we rotate this at a weird angle, so it's not global, and yeah, we're on normal, and I'll move this and snap it to an axis. You can see those axes are now in orientation to the object, not to the global space. Versus if I hit comma and I move over to global, and then I move it along an axis, it's now snapping to the world axis. Okay, so very important. You might need to switch back and forth depending on how you want to slide things around and move them, but you need to keep that in mind. With the period key, there's a few really important ones here. Real quick, if you change the pivot point to 3D cursor, and then we hit R, it'll rotate around the 3D cursor without you needing to move the origin, like we talked about in the other section. So that's useful to know. I'm going to switch it back to the bounding box center though, and then we'll see that it rotates around its own space, which I want to keep it that way for now. If you have two different cubes, or let's say a few different cubes in a scene, and I'm going to select them all, and then by holding Shift, and then hit the period key and hold it, you'll see some slightly different important options, and let's see what they do. So right now, if I go to median point and let go of the period key, and we've now selected that, you can see it's turned blue. Remember, you don't have to click anything with these pie menus. You just hover over the one you want to change and let go of the hotkey. So we're on median point, and I'm going to hit S to scale, and we'll see that they're scaling in relation to each other from the middle point of those objects. Okay, so that's kind of scaling them all together at once. If I hit the period key and change it to individual origins, and then hit S to scale, they'll all scale along their own individual orange dot, which is their origin. So that's something that comes up quite a bit between median point and individual origins. I think that is mostly what you need to know for now. Global and normal for orientation, and then median point and individual origins. You can also do 3D cursor for this. So I'll change it to 3D cursor, go into top view. We'll see what happens when we hit scale. Yeah, it's scaling in relation to wherever we place the 3D cursor. All right, let's talk about how cameras work in Blender. This one is going to be super fun and very useful for making renders, which we're about to get into. So in the default scene, you actually get this camera set up automatically for you. And you can always hit Shift A and create a new one if you wanted to, but let's just use this one for now. So if you have a camera selected, first of all, it works just like any other mesh in Blender, where you can move it around with the G key. You can even scale it in the scene. You can rotate it, and that's good to know about in certain cases. If you go ahead and click this little camera button, you go right into the camera view itself. And there is a hotkey for that, though. I believe it's Control-0 on the numpad, but that'll actually take you into the active objects view. So if you want to use that hotkey, and then you just have to select the camera first, then hit Control-0 on the numpad. If you want to get out of the camera view, you just have to rotate with the middle mouse button, and you'll rotate out of there. Let's go back in here for a second. You can actually use the standard move tools like G, for example, while you're in camera view. You can also rotate while you're in camera view, and you can scale while you're in camera view, and that won't actually do too much, except unless you clip over the object that we're viewing. So I wouldn't recommend scaling it too much. There's a better way to navigate, though, in Blender and than using those standard tools. And that's while you're in camera view, you hit Shift tilde, and now we're able to move our mouse, and it'll move the camera kind of from a fixed point, almost like you're in a video game and you're kind of looking around, and then you can click to accept that move. So I always use this hotkey when I'm adjusting the camera. It's much better, I think, than using the other tools. And if you want to move around, just like you're in a video game as well, you can actually hit the W, A, S, and D keys. And you can kind of use those to control the view as if you're walking around, and then with the mouse as well, look around with that. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but if you're familiar at all with video games, that's a very common way to look around. And then of course you can always just click and it'll accept that whole move. If you weren't happy with it, let's say you hit Shift tilde and then you're moving around and you're not happy with the change, you want to go back, you just hit Escape and it'll snap back to wherever you started out from. So one more trick about that: if you hit Shift tilde and you're moving around with the W, A, S, and D keys, you can hold Shift and it'll act like a sprint, and it'll move a little bit faster than if you are not holding Shift. So keep that in mind. There's another couple of tricks to the camera that I want to mention right away. So this border is the view that your camera's actually seeing, but Blender actually shows you everything that's around that too, which sometimes you want and sometimes you don't. So if you go ahead down here and click this camera menu icon, scroll down here, open up Viewport Display, you can actually slide this pass part out all the way up, and that'll black out everything except what your camera's seeing, which I actually do quite often just so that I know I can get a feel for exactly what the camera's looking at. If you have multiple cameras in your scene, let's go ahead and add one, Shift A, camera, and you'll see there's two cameras now. If I'll click the second one there and go to view selected, we'll see that it actually placed where the 3D cursor was. So let's move it out of there. And now that I'm selected on this object, if I click the camera or hit numpad 0, it'll take us to, you'll see it actually took us to the other camera because that camera is still the active object. So we actually have to go in here and make a little box, and it'll select the new camera, and now it'll take us there if we hit numpad 0. So you got to kind of keep in mind which camera is currently active. It's a little bit confusing. So the best way, I think, is just to make sure you're selected in the viewport, and then you hit either this camera icon or the numpad 0. And now we're able to move this around with the same controls. Let's look at it from another angle, maybe a bit farther away. Oh, and while you're in camera view, I don't know if I mentioned this, but you can actually use the scroll wheel. And this won't move your camera's position. It'll just shrink the size of the little view finder there. So if you kind of want to like see what's around it, sometimes that's helpful. But generally speaking, I like to keep it pretty big so that I know exactly what we're looking at. All right, I want to make sure we talk about camera clipping and also viewport clipping in Blender. And it can actually be a little bit annoying if you're not sure what's going on. This kind of took me a while to figure out when I was first starting out with Blender, so I just wanted to mention it so you're aware of it. And what that is basically if we are to select this cube and zoom way, way, way out, and then if we just move it, or let's scale it up actually so that we're able to see it even when it's far away. And if we just move it along the y-axis for a little while, we'll see eventually right there, it's actually completely disappearing when it crosses a certain mark. And that is the case also in camera view. But there's actually two different places to fix that. So in viewport, regular viewport view, if you hit the letter N key, it brings up this menu. And this is going to be quite important later on, but all we need to know right now is if you click over here to this view option, you can see there's the few options for the way the viewport looks and works. First of all, focal length is nice to know about. If you adjust that, actually you'll get like a longer and shorter lens inside the viewport, which is sometimes useful. But what we're looking at is this clip start and clip end option. And if you just extend the clip end option, that's basically the distance at where the cube would disappear. So we can just go right ahead and change that from 1,000 to like, I don't know, 100,000 something. And you can see the grid's getting much, much bigger there. And now we'll be able to move that cube really, really far without needing to adjust it. So that's quite useful to know. Clip start, by the way, is just if you get really, really close to an object, it'll kind of guess when you want it to clip, but that won't make as much of a difference, I don't think. So the clipping when you're looking through the camera itself is a little bit harder to find. So let's go into the camera view by hitting the 0 key and the numpad. And let's actually move the camera over a little bit and look down a little bit longer on the y-axis so that we can show this. And let's move the cube. I'm just going to hit G and then Y to move it along the y-axis until it starts disappearing. You see that's where it's clipping. And that's the, I believe, 1,000 meters that the camera is set to. So what we actually have to do is select the camera itself. And we go down to this little camera menu option that appears here. And the clipping is right here, clip start and clip end. And we can change that to 100,000. So definitely want to be aware that that might be happening in certain really large scenes. All right, let's talk about modifiers. You can access this menu over here if you click on this little wrench option, and you see this add modifier menu in here, and that gives you this massive drop down of all these different modifiers. And what modifiers are, they're basically non-destructive changes to meshes. So Blender, this is one of the strengths of Blender, I think, and that is if you make add a modifier to an object, You can continue to mess with it later, and you can always delete the modifier and go back to your original mesh, or you can continue to edit the modifier and make slight changes with it. So it's kind of you can add on like 100 different modifiers to one object, and then you can still go back if you need to and delete them. So it's a very useful tool. So first up, we're going to show you Array. Array gives you this little menu right here, and we can collapse this and open this up to see all our different modifiers in here. I'm going to expand this just so you can see the title there. It says Array. And we can adjust the count, and that'll just add more boxes in this line. If I hit tab, we'll see there's actually still only that first box in the actual geometry. The rest of these are sort of instances of that box. Down here, there's different factors. So right now it's 1 on the x-axis, which means it's the next count is exactly 1 box over along the x-axis. So if I were to lower that, they would kind of slide into each other a bit. And if I were to expand that, they would kind of space out differently. If I were to adjust the y, it would array them along the y as well. And then, of course, the z would go vertically. So you can mess with all these, and we'll definitely be using them in the next section. I'm going to X this to delete the modifier from that cube. And right here, we can see it's not in the modifier stack anymore. Let's try adding a couple more. In fact, let's add 2 more. So let's add an array. Then we'll collapse that, add modifier, and a mirror. So right away, some things happen there. But just to explain something really quick, you can have multiple modifiers on an object, and they stack on top of each other from top to bottom. So first, in this case, there's an array, then there's a mirror on top of that. And in some cases, when you have really complicated modifiers and quite a few in the stack, it does matter which order they are. And you can click and drag them to readjust them. And you can see right there, because it's being mirrored first and then arrayed, something did change. And in certain cases, you got to pay attention to that stack. Remember, it's from top to bottom. All right, so I'm going to X this array, and it's just so that we can talk about the mirror one for a second. So once I got rid of the array, actually, the mirror isn't doing anything. And that's because it's currently mirroring around the origin of this object. So if I were to hit G, move this over here along this axis, still nothing's happening, and that's because it's being mirrored along that origin. So what happens if we hit spacebar, and I've already remembering that the last thing I searched for is setting origin to the 3D cursor, which is exactly what I want right now. So I'll hit enter, and we'll see the orange dot moved to the 3D cursor, and then right away the mirror is taking effect because it's mirroring this object across the origin. And if I hit tab, you'll see once again, this is actually just an instance. The geometry is really over here. If I go into top view, I'm going to move this thing around. Because the origin's moving with it, the mirror isn't continually being adjusted, right? They're moving together. But if I go into edit mode, and let's say I select one of these faces, you can actually select all the faces in edit mode by hitting the A key. A is kind of select all in Blender. So if I, just to finish this thought, if I select all the faces in edit mode and hit G to move those faces, we can see the instance that's being mirrored is moving with it. And that's because the origin itself isn't moving when you make changes in edit mode, as opposed to in object mode, the origin does move with it. So that's something to watch out for when you're mirroring. You can mess with all the menu options here for more stuff. Let's go into a side view really quick, front view, I guess. Move this down. You can actually mirror across the other axes as well. Let's try Z. Still nothing's happening, and that's because we need to set the origin back to the 3D cursor so that it can mirror across it. So very powerful tool. Both the array and the mirror tool in combination are especially powerful. And once again, you need to be aware of the order that they're stacking. Real quick, so just one note about modifiers. So they are endlessly editable, and that means if I click and delete these, we'll get back to the original cube that we started with. But let's say I wanted to just delete the array, but let's say I wanted to keep the mirror forever. Okay, so right now, let's say I'm completely happy with the way that's being mirrored. I never want it to change again. Oops, we went into camera view there. We're not quite ready to talk about that. So if I'm selecting on this, you can actually click this drop down and click apply, or you can just hover over it and hit Control A. And that will apply the modifier to the cube. And now if we go into edit mode, you can see there's actually geometry in all four of those cubes because it made those instances into real geometry that we can select different faces of because we applied the modifier. So you don't necessarily need to apply your modifiers, but in certain cases you might want to if you're happy with them. So just keep that in mind. And then we'll go over some more modifiers in a second. All right, we're just going to talk about a couple more modifiers here. So if I select our cube, click Add Modifier, I'm actually have to hover down here to scroll down, and I'm going to click Subdivision Surface. And this is very common in other 3D programs as well. Yeah, if you're familiar with this kind of workflow at all, but let's talk about it in terms of Blender. So right away, our cube changed a little bit, and that is because we're adding more faces and information than just the sides of the cube. So if I go ahead and click Tab, we'll see there is actually a cube, and that's kind of the orange cube that we started with, but the modifier is adding more information to that cube, and it's basically making it a more complex object. Okay, so in here in the menu right here, we'll see that what's showing in the viewport is actually different than what's going to be showing in the render. So I'm actually going to click that up to 2, and we'll see that's actually how complex it's going to become. So there's a few really important uses to this subdivision modifier, and for our purposes, all we're going to talk about it is it's sort of a very light way, it's light on Blender, to add more information and detail to an object. But you can still hit Tab if we select a face of this cube and move it over here. You'll see the rest of it is stretching with it. And that's very useful because we only need to make simple changes, and it'll make a complex change to this complex object. So let's see what happens really quick. If I go ahead and hit Control R on this ghosted cube, and I click to create a new edge, and I'll move it around, you'll see the rest of it is following the complexity of the ghosted cube. So if I click to accept, then I'll make another cut, click to move it, and click to accept. You can see that we're actually able to sort of sculpt the density of this subdivision just by using this simple form, if we go back into edit mode, of the box. So this is a very common method of sculpting. And if you right click and shade this smooth, you'll see that you actually are getting a totally different shape now. But if we go into tab mode, it really just came from a box. So there's a lot of different information out there how to model with Sub-D, it's called, in Blender and other programs. But for our purposes, I just want you to be made aware of it because just by adding complexity, and you can up this to even more density. If we go into flat, we'll see it's getting even more complex there. It's just a really important thing to know about. All right, I want to go over a very useful modeling tool in Blender, and that is the Falloff or proportional editing option. And let's illustrate that by going into edit mode here and adding a lot of cuts to this object. Click and right click to accept, Control R, scroll wheel, click and right click to accept. Let's do some this way as well. And if we just go ahead and select a single face on this cube, and with the normal settings, if we just hit G and move that, you'll see the face itself moves, but only the edges that are connected to it will move with it. But if we cancel that and we turn on proportional editing, and that's this option right here, and check that on, and then if we start moving that face, we see we get this circle around it. And you can see that circle is sort of the range of fall off that's the other faces are moving with that selected face. We can edit the size of that circle, but with the scroll wheel as we're going. And you can get some really interesting effects if you make a really large circle. We got a really nice slow gradient fall off of movement versus if we make it really small, it's a lot sharper, but still quite useful. This also works quite well with edges. So if I go into edge mode and Alt click to select this whole loop, for example, and let's do this in orthographic mode. If I were just to scale that up and adjust the size of the proportional fall off, you'll see we get some really interesting modeling shapes. It could almost be like a vase or a pot or something. So very quickly, it's a really useful tool in a lot of different scenarios, and it'll especially be helpful, I think, when we import our 3D coat models, because a lot of times when you import models from sculpting programs, you get thousands and thousands of triangles, and this fall off or proportional editing is very helpful with dealing with them. So that's pretty much it. Definitely mess around, and you can also adjust the profile of this option if you click this drop down. I really don't do this too often, but you can try all these different scenarios and they'll have some slightly different effects. But usually I just keep it on smooth. That's generally what you're looking for. All right, let's talk about duplicating and instancing in Blender. There's a few ways to do this, and I'm just going to go over the ones that I like and use. So I have a default cube here, and the first thing is Shift D is duplicate. And it duplicates it right in place. So if you move your mouse and then click, you can move it to a different area. Or you can just hit Shift D and then click, and it'll duplicate right on top of the other one. And you can see there's two there now, so I can go ahead and select one or the other and move it out of the way. So Shift D, that's the basic way of duplicating. There's another way to create a linked duplication, though, that I want to talk about. And that's Alt D. And if I move that over here for a second, it works very similar where it duplicates, but these two cubes are actually linked with Alt D. What that means is if I select one and go into edit mode and make a change, I'll just select this face and move it out here. You'll see it still is linked to the old mesh, and they'll both update and change. And that's true if I make another few with Alt D and then make a change, they're all still linked. If you want to unlink them, though, let's say I just wanted this one to be its own unlinked cube, I can go over here to these menu options over here and click this little green 3 triangle object data one, and that takes us to here. And this number right here is saying that there's 4 linked objects in this kind of set. And if I select this one and then click this number, it'll unlink from the other 3. So now if I make a change to this, it will not update the others, but the rest of these are still linked. So that's Alt D. The only caveat to that method is that I don't think that it's any lighter on Blender to, let's say you have a really complex object with a lot of different faces, and then you duplicate it with Alt D all over the scene. It's still quite heavy on Blender, so that can be a problem if you're rendering and things are crashing. So another sort of instancing method that I think is lighter on the program is this is by putting it into a collection and then instancing that collection. So let's show you what I mean there. So I'm going to go into top view here just to see, and I'll Shift D just to duplicate this a bunch of times around. And I'll select all those cubes, and I'll hit M and put them into cubes 1. Okay, so let's drop this down so we can see what we're doing. And now you see we had that original collection and then this new collection that we created, and everything, all the cubes are in there. And if I right click that collection and then click instance to scene, you can see we created an instance of that whole group, that whole collection, and that's right here. And it placed right on top, so you actually can't even see it. But if you select that instance and then move it over, you'll see that there was a duplication of that whole collection. Now, this instance that we created, you can't actually edit it here. So if I hit tab, nothing happens. You also can't add modifiers to it. So it's a little bit limited, but if I go back to this original group and make a change, even just moving one of the objects in it, it'll change that in the instance. So this whole instance is a instance of this group, right? And that'll go for individual changes on faces. That'll go for the placement of objects. That'll also go for modifiers. Everything in this whole group is now instanced to here. So this method is, I believe, anyways, the lightest version on Blender. So if we had really complex objects in this group and we wanted to instance it all over the whole scene, this would be the way to go. Yeah, just wanted to make you aware of all of those options. You can also duplicate this instance. So if I click on the instance and then Shift D that, we'll get a duplication of that. And so now this is just another instance of this first group. And you see that both changing when I make a note about. All right, let's talk about adding materials to objects in Blender. We're just going to go over the absolute basics here in the actual kind of workflow part. In the next section, I'll do, my way of adding actual textures and materials. But for now, I just want you to be aware of how the system works, just to get you started. So right now we're in this basic mode of viewing objects in Blender, and everything is going to be gray regardless of the material. So if you hover over here, you see these different spheres up here. That's different views in Blender. And if you click this one over here, we'll actually go into wireframe mode and we'll see the wireframe of the cube. This is the basic, viewport shaded, gray shaded one. And then this next one over is actually the materials. And it's still somewhat gray, but it did change. And it's going to be our preferred method of viewing materials. And then this final one is the rendered view. And just real quick, we'll click on that and we'll see there's actually a light in our scene by default. And if I move that around, now that we're in rendered view, the light is changing, it's starting to actually render on our objects. But we're not going to talk about that just yet. I just want you to be aware of these 4 different views. So I'm going to go back to the material view. There is a hotkey for switching between these, by the way, and that's the letter Z on the keyboard. And here's those 4 in different method, and you can hover over and select one to switch to that view. Okay, so let's go back to material view, and let's add some materials to this cube just to see how it kind of works. So that is this little menu option right here. It's second from the bottom on this list. That's kind of how the simplest way to start adding materials. And this object currently has no material slots. So we need to create a slot by clicking this plus sign and then click new to create a new material. And we'll title this, how about red? We'll make this part red in a second. So now there's one material slot on this cube. And if we scroll down here, right away we get this really long list of information and changes to a material. And all I'm going to do right now is click on this base color one and change it to red. And right away we see our cube has turned to red. Now, just as a reminder, we're in material mode now, so we're able to see the materials. If I hit Z and go over to solid mode, everything turns gray again, even though we still have the red applied. So if yours isn't changing, got to make sure you're on material view. Or in rendered view, by the way, and then the red will be affected by the lights. So let's go back to material view, and I want to add another material slot to this cube. So I'll click plus, new, and I'll rename this material blue. And nothing's changed, and that's because we haven't assigned this new material to anything yet. But before we do that, I'm going to I'm selected on the blue slot, and then I'll go ahead and click base color change that to blue, and and you'll see it update there in the thumbnail, just so that when we do apply it, everything will look correct. So if we select, so right now everything's red, and that's because we only had one slot when we created that material. So if we wanted to add a blue side to this thing, we would have to go into Tab, Edit Mode, hit 3 or click that to go into Face Mode, and then we'll select a single face here. Then we'll click on the blue slot and click Assign. And now, if I select out and go back to Object Mode, we'll see that we've assigned that single face, the blue slot material, and the rest of it is still assigned to the red slot material. Hopefully that makes some sense. And you'll see if I click on these different faces where it's telling us which of the materials slots is currently assigned. If I wanted to make them all blue, I would have to hit the A key to select all the faces, then click the blue, then click Assign. And that should assign blue to everything. Okay. You can have many, many different material slots. You can create, 100 different colors. And you can, if you had a really complex object, you might want to assign a ton of different materials or just colors to it. So if you want to remove them, though, you have to click on the material you want to remove in the slot, and then click this minus sign, and that'll delete them from this list. So if I had another object in here, let's create one. Hit Shift D and move it over here. This slot list has been duplicated from that original cube, but this new duplication should still have its own slot. So if I create a new slot and I'll hit New, let's say I'll make a yellow slot, and I'll change that to yellow. And then, following the same method, we'll hit Tab, select all, and click Assign. That shouldn't change the other cube, and then in fact, these slots of this object are only for this new object. So if I go ahead and click the old cube, you'll see that yellow slot disappears because it has its own set of slots. Hopefully that makes some sense. If you scroll down in any of these slots, by the way, you should see quite a few different sort of more realistic options, and you can mess with a lot of these sliders. It won't make too much difference unless you have proper photo textures in there. But generally speaking, roughness is kind of the reflective properties. So less roughness will be more reflective, and you can almost kind of see that there. It's starting to reflect some of the world. Metallic, self-explanatory. Roughness and metallic for right now are probably all we need to know about. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of how materials and slots work. I need to mention right away, though, there is something called nodes in Blender. And if right now we're in layout kind of tab, if I go ahead and click this shading tab, it'll take us to a much more complex way to edit materials. And down here in the bottom half of the screen, this is the node system. And this is, it's the same information as we saw before about the different colors, but this area allows us to create a lot more complexity to this material. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but I just want you to be aware that this is sort of the space where you actually get realistic materials. But for now, let's go back to layout and select these different options. And just by editing these simpler options here is a much faster way to get used to the system. One more note on the way this menu works with materials. I didn't mention this little important drop down right here, and that will give you a list of all the materials in your whole Blender scene. So you'll notice right now, if I'm selected on this object, we only had the red and blue slots, not the yellow slot. But if I select this drop down, we'll see the yellow, and that's because it's in our scene somewhere. And if I select it, it'll change that slot to that material. So we didn't add a new slot, we still only have 2, but that slot was changed to yellow, and now everything that was assigned to that slot will change. Hopefully that makes some sense. And if I click back on this other one, we'll see there were 3 slots on that one, and this current slot is yellow, but I could change it to blue, for example, that we would have 2 blue slots, and all of these faces were assigned to that third one, so it went ahead and changed. Real quick, if you have 100 materials in this list, you can actually just start typing the exact material you want, and it should find it. Then you can click it. I want to illustrate a really important hotkey for using one material that you've already set up on one object and applying it to other objects. So as we already talked about, if I wanted to make this cube red, I could just select it. And right now the blue material is the only one in its slot. But if we just click this drop down, it'll show us all the materials in the whole scene. And if I just select red, it'll change that slot to red and it'll go ahead. But this becomes a little bit more difficult if, let's say, we had 100 of these objects all around and we wanted them all to become red. We would have to go in and do that for each one, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem. So a better way to do it is to select everything at once, and then hold Shift and select the object that you want to take the material from last. So I'll hold Shift and select that, and then I'll hit Control L for link, and you get this link menu here. And all of these are actually very useful in different scenarios, but in this case we just want link materials, and you'll see it'll all these other objects grabbed the same exact material slots that this original red cube had, and then they all, not only that, but there was only one material in the slot, so they're automatically assigned the correct way. That link option also works quite well with modifiers, by the way, and let's just illustrate that really quick. I know we're talking about materials right now, but it's worth mentioning this, I think. So what happens if we go ahead and add a mirror modifier to this, and we will reflect it across the Y. And let's say we add in another cube over here, and we will set the origin point to 3D cursor. And let's say we wanted to copy all the modifiers on this cube over to this one. Not just, this will work even if you have multiple modifiers, not just one. So all you have to do is select the one that you want, or select the one you want to apply it to, and then hold Shift and select the one you want to grab from last. Then hit Control L, and instead of link materials in this case, I want to copy modifiers. If I go ahead and do that, select away, we'll see that on these gray cubes, it did grab that mirror modifier from the red ones, and that's quite useful in a lot of scenarios as well. So just wanted to make you aware of that Control L hotkey. It'll come up a lot. Okay, let's talk about just very basic adding photo textures into a material. So we're not going to get too deep into this, but I just want to make you aware of generally how it works. So I've actually gone over to textures.com, and I found this free 3D scan stone wall option. And all the maps that we're going to need to use are completely free on there, so it's a good one to try out. And there's lots of different sites out there where you can find decent, 3D materials. Some are free, some aren't. We're gonna probably be using Quixel Bridge a little bit later for our tutorial, and there's a lot of great textures on that. But for now, let's just use this one, and just to give you an understanding of how these different maps and nodes work. So I'm going to go ahead and download this large 2048 size of each of these maps. And I think that's going to be high enough resolution for us to kind of get started here. All right, and I've actually just moved those downloaded maps from my downloads folder into a folder on my desktop so that I can easily find them. So now that that's set up there, we're going to click over back to our Blender file. And let's actually click over to the shading tab up here. And right away, you get a lot more different types of boxes. First of all, this viewport switched over automatically to the material view. And also there's a HDRI map in there to automatically by default. And that's just kind of like a image that'll make the preview lighting a little bit more interesting. So that'll help us a little bit. But otherwise, this viewport is working exactly the same as the layout tab. And down here are the nodes. And this is kind of the more complex way to view the materials. And you'll notice if you scroll in here, this default material came with this principled BDSF or BSDF node automatically. And you'll notice that the menu options here are exactly the same as the ones we've already talked about over here. And that's because they are the same. The node view is just a little bit more complex way to look at them. So to import the textures that we just downloaded, all we need to do is click on that green node there. And before you import them, you need to make sure the Node Wrangler add-on is enabled, which comes with Blender automatically, but you do have to actually enable it. So all you have to do is click Edit, Preferences, go over to Add-ons, search Node Wrangler, and check that on. And let's X out that. And now that that's enabled, if you click on this green node once again and hit Control-Shift-T, the textures that we downloaded are right here. And if we select all by holding Shift and click Principled Texture Setup, it should automatically bring in all those textures the correct way, and they're all set up nicely the way we want them to be. But you have to do that by hitting the Control-Shift-T option. And again, you have to make sure the Node Wrangler is turned on. So now that came in, and there's a few options that we should probably talk about to rescale and adjust things. So if we let's click and drag these two, and then if you hit the G key, you can move things over just a little bit. And all the way on the left here, you can see that it came in with this mapping node, and that's hooked up to all the different maps here. And you don't need to know exactly what all these maps do right now. All you need to know is that if you want to adjust the scale right now, you can just do that right here on the mapping node. So if you click and drag across all three of these, and then move your mouse to the left or right, we should be able to scale all three axes together. You don't want to just move one at a time unless you want to stretch things, right? Because that's scaling it just on the X or just on the Y. So if you click and drag across all three, or two, in that case, you can move them together. Okay. So this is working well, and it's nice and easy because it's just a box. So it came in UV mapped correctly. We're not going to talk about mapping everything correctly too much, except to say that it will come up in the next section when we actually get into the Fantasy Palace. All right, I want to just talk about how lights work in Blender and a few of the different options that you have. So by default, this light that's right in here automatically is a point light. And if you select it, you get this little light bulb menu down here. And if you open that up, you'll see some information about this light. First of all, there's confirmed that it is a point light, the color, the different settings of the light itself. And if we switch right over to rendered view, we'll be able to see that light in action. So if I hit the G key, we'll see that the light is affecting the cube in real time. So right away we can try changing the color here. We can try changing the power, which is just kind of like the brightness. And with point lights, it matters how far away the light is from the object it's affecting. So if I move this further away, it'll get dimmer, and if I move it closer, it'll get brighter. And you can mess with all these different settings. A lot of them somewhat self-explanatory, but it's good to get used to them. So let's go over some of the other options. You can actually put another light into the scene by hitting Shift-A and clicking Light, and then selecting another type of light. And then you can move it around just like a regular object. Oops. Or you can just select the original light and then click one of these options to change the type. So let's go ahead and change this type to the sun. And we'll see, there we go, it just changed into a sun. And first things first, the power or the strength of the sun is by default much higher, like kind of a scale than the point light. So let's change that even down to like a 5. And we'll say that's much more reasonable. And the sun works just like, it tries to imitate a real sun, so it doesn't matter how far away it is from the object. It'll be a constant light source. Shadows will be constant as well. But you can adjust the angle, which will matter by just using the R rotate key, or you can mess with the angle here, and that'll adjust as well. So definitely useful if you're trying to set up a realistic sun. We'll go over how to set up a real daylight scenario in a few minutes. You can click over to the next option here. That's the spotlight. And this works just like a regular spotlight that you would see in like a theater or something. First of all, let's up the power again to something like 200. You can see it's just barely affecting the cube there. So let's try 2000. And there's a few options. You can mess with the spotlight itself. First of all, there's the radius. That is kind of how diffuse or sharp the light will be. And you can see if I shrink it way down, it's going to be very sharp on the cube. And if I kind of push it way up, it's going to be a very diffuse or soft light. This also is a setting on the point light, by the way. You can also, with the spotlight, you can mess with the size of the cone itself, right? So the cube inside the angle there will be lit. But if I put another cube over here, it's going to pass the edge of this cone and it'll be outside the lighting. And I believe you can scale the spot size and shape itself, right? So if we scale that up, it'll affect the other cube. And then once we cross over with the angle of the cone, it'll go into darkness. So that's quite useful to know. I think blend is the inner softness of the spotlight. So let's have it cross over this just a little bit. And if we adjust the blend, you'll see that is kind of the sharpness of that fall off. So that's very useful to know. And then last up, we have the area light. And it actually has kind of a weird shape there because it's transferring over from these other lights. Let's just delete that and then click Shift A and put in a new area light. And we'll see if we zoom in, or I think it placed on the cube, so to scale it up or move it up a bit. We'll see normally they have kind of a box shape. And this is it's very similar to a point light, except it's a little bit more directional. So I guess it's kind of closer to the sun actually, except it's a lot less powerful, right? So it points in a certain direction. You can scale up with the S key to affect more objects and also get a different diffuse or sharpness. So let's try showing that by putting another cube over here. And if we scale this up, we'll see that it'll affect everything in the scene, but it'll also get more diffuse. So that's why it looks like it's getting darker. So we actually have to adjust with the diffuse or the power itself to get it stronger. And you'll see now it's affecting them differently. So definitely mess with all these. Oh, and you can also scale the shape of the area light with the S key, just like if it were a regular cube. And now it'll be kind of affecting things in this line. You can see it's barely affecting this because we scaled it almost off that. So very useful in certain scenarios. So definitely try out all of these. And in a second, we're going to talk about other ways to get a realistic sun in your scene, but all of these are useful in different cases. All right, so let's talk about setting up a very basic sky and sun setup in Blender, just for some quick renders if you're just getting started. There is a really great plugin for this, and if I hit the N key, oh, it looks like I don't have it installed right now, but it's called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, and you can find it on the Blender Market, and I highly recommend looking at it, but it is a bit pricey. I can't remember how much it costs. I think it's around $50 or more. So that is one really great option that will give a lot of kind of more editable possibilities, but there is a new great sky option that's completely free that comes with Blender, and I want to show you that right now. So let's hit N to hide that, and let's do it. So the first thing is I'm in the layout tab right now, but I actually want to access the shading editor. So I could go over to the shader tab, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to hover over here and drag this little area up. And I'm actually going to click this and change this over to the shader editor since we already have it in here. So yeah, you can change this to any of those different tabs up there, but for now we just want the shader. And now you'll see we get these nodes which affect the materials. But for right now, we don't want to affect object materials. We actually want to affect world materials. So I'm going to click this drop down and switch over to world right here. And you can see by default, there's a little background node clicked to or hooked up to the world output. So what we want to do is delete the background, then click Shift A and click on search, and then just start typing sky texture and hit enter. And then it'll move around with your mouse and you just click to accept that placement. And then last kind of step here, we hook up the color node by clicking and dragging to the surface plug in the world output node. So it's a little bit of legwork you have to do, but it's pretty fast once you know what to do. And now if we hit the Z key and go up to render view, we'll see everything is completely white. And that is because it's currently set to this Nishita option, which is not available in Eevee. So it's only good with cycles, and it's probably the best option that Blender has. But real quick, if we do click this dropdown and try some of these other options, you'll see we do kind of get like a bluish sky, and you can sort of edit the lighting by clicking and rotating this circle here. So this is, and then you can also mess with the turbidity, which I think is just kind of the brightness of the skylight itself. So that in combination with a sunlight might be useful, but there's also this other option right here, and that looks slightly different. You can try that out as well. You can move that angle around, and if you go below the horizon, you'll get kind of like a sunset-ish. So that's quite fast. Ground albedo, you can mess with that and see what that does, turbidity. But we're not going to go over that too much because you really can't do too much with that. So let's actually try. Let's go back to Nishita, and then let's switch over to cycles so that we can see that in progress. And then don't forget to switch over to GPU compute every time you're using cycles. And everything, now we have a lot more options that we can mess with. So first of all, everything's a little bit too bright for me, so I'm going to lower the sun intensity a little bit. And what else? You can lower the sun elevation itself, and you can see we're getting this little sun over there. And we're getting some nice sunset colors, you know, from the horizon upward. And basically, you should just mess around with all of these options. You know, that's just kind of what I do. Sun rotation will allow you to actually move that sun around, and you'll see we're getting some nice direct sunlight on the cube now. Altitude, I believe that is kind of the way the skylight itself works. Sun size, I believe, is the size of this disk. So yeah, if we up that, we'll get kind of like a larger sun. But notice that doesn't really change. Oh, it does actually change the lighting on the cube itself, so that's good to know about. But you probably don't want that too bright, just so that you're getting some of the, you know, realistic colors. What else? The air, that's going to add more atmosphere, so that's very useful to know. Dust, you should just mess with as well. Ozone, you can mess with that and you'll get some different effects. And then don't forget, if you do put the sun elevation at a negative, you'll get, you know, everything will kind of become nighttime. And if we lower this, we'll actually see some nighttime looking skies. Right now there is a light though in the scene. It's this point light. That's why it's so bright. Let's delete that. Now it's looking like a more realistic night. So that's very fast and easy way to set up a lighting scenario. And don't forget, you have to click over back to the object if you want to mess with your object materials. But yeah, you should definitely be using this, and it's a great option, and we'll use this as well in the next stages. All right, let's go over just a little bit about how rendering and exporting renders works in Blender. So as you can see, I have two cubes in here, just assigned a couple of basic colors to each so that we can see what we're doing. And if I go ahead and click this button, it's the switch over to render option, or the rendering view in the viewport option. We'll see right away that we are getting this light that came in by default affecting these cubes. And if I move them around, we can see everything's working correctly. Now, if I go ahead and click this camera button, we'll view the cubes through the default camera there. We can move it around if, like we talked about in the other section, if we want to get a different angle. Let's just say stick with that for now. And by the way, I just hid the overlays, which is all this extra UI in there. By you can either click this button right here to show or hide the overlays, or the hotkeys Shift Alt Z. So anyways, let's say we're happy with that and we want to do a render. Well, there's a couple things we need to talk about real quick. The fastest way that, just by default, everything's set up for is if we just go ahead and click render image, or the hotkey for that is F12. Let's do that. And we'll see if I zoom out with the scroll wheel, we got a perfect render just like we were looking at on the camera. And you can click this image, save as, and save it to your desktop anywhere you want. So that's just real quick, how that's going to work. Let's exit out of that though. There's a few other options here we really should talk about. So by default, the render engine in Blender is set to Eevee. And you can find that here in this menu button. That's all the render options. And in a nutshell, Eevee is the real-time option for Blender. So basically what that means for you is it's a lot faster than any of the other options. You'll be able to view the lighting updating very, very, very quickly when you move things around and when you move the lights around. It tends to be a little bit more difficult to get it to look perfectly realistic. So there's a lot of extra settings in here that you have to kind of mess with, especially in certain lighting situations. If there's a lot of sunlight, or sometimes in a lot of bright lighting scenarios where you'd need a lot of ambient occlusion for things to look correct. So it can be a little bit more difficult. Even though it's so fast and easy to use, it can be a little bit difficult to get it to look really good, but it's a great option to know about. So if you could go ahead and click this drop down, you can see a couple other render engine options. Workbench, we're not going to talk too much about. I think that's just the sort of kind of like using the viewport as a test. So we're not going to worry about that. But the other one we need to talk about is cycles. So cycles is essentially a lot more realistic and better looking outside of the box. So for beginners, I think if you don't need something to work really, really fast, but you still want it to look really good, cycles would probably be a better place to start, in my opinion. But you do need sometimes a better computer for it to work well, because it is a lot more intense for the computer than Eevee is. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So if I click cycles, you can see because this is such a simple scene, we're already able to view it. But if I move around, we're getting a little bit of pixelation there. I don't know if you can actually see that. And what that is it's sort of like a preview, but because it's so much more processing involved for cycles, that it needs to do that, and then it's able to resolve itself when we stop moving around. And if this were a really complex scene, that would take a lot longer to settle. So we'd get a lot of pixelation before, as you can see as I'm moving around, before it sort of resolves and keeps rendering. And right away you can see, actually, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a really nice bounce light right here with cycles. And if we switch back over to Eevee, that goes away. And again, you can get Eevee to look that realistic, but it takes a little bit of messing around, and it's a little bit more complicated. So let's switch back over to cycles, and you can see it's just looking a lot more realistic with a perfect highlight and bounce light and everything. All the shadows are looking more correct. So let's stick with cycles, and there's a couple really important options to optimize cycles that we need to do. Right now we're using CPU for cycles, and in most cases you want to click that and switch over to GPU compute. And basically what that means is you're going to be using your actual graphics card to render, which in almost always will be way, way faster. And real quick, you can check if you even have a good graphics card if you don't know too much about it by clicking Edit, Preferences, and get this option here. And over here in System, we'll see we actually need, it'll tell us a little bit about our graphics card. We actually need to switch over from none to this option right here. And you can see that's my graphics card, and that'll be checked on. And I think you can check on this too, and that means it'll be using everything that the computer has to offer to render very quickly. So yeah, make sure you've selected this option and check that on. You can just X out of this. And I don't know if you can actually tell, but it is actually a little bit faster. You can see it's resolving right away. And that's just because, again, we set it to GPU compute, and we checked on preferences system, and we checked on the actual graphics card. Okay, so let's go back to our camera view, and let's shift the camera view a little bit so that we can see some of our cubes a little bit better. And let's talk a little bit more about making renders. So with cycles, it is the same button. It's either render image or just F12 to make a render. But before you do that, if you click on this menu option right here, there's a few more options that you probably want to be aware of. First of all, the resolution of the render is going to be really important. So by default, it's set to this aspect ratio and pixel size. And you can actually just, you can edit these if you want, and that'll change the aspect ratio of the camera view, as you can see there. You can edit that as well. You can also just change this 100%. Let's change it to like 200%, for example. And if we went ahead and made a render now, it would take a little bit longer because it'll be more high resolution, but it'll be 200% of what we've set here. So that's really good to know about. One more option I just want to talk about real quick. If we go down, or actually it's in this menu option. If we scroll down here to this film option and unfurl that menu, there's this transparent checkbox. And if we check that on, we'll see that we're able to get the cubes on a transparent background. And when we make a render and save it out, it'll be a PNG transparent background. So that's very useful to know. And we'll be doing that in the next section as well. Anything else to talk about here? Real quick, so there are a few options here that you should at least know about for optimization. So under this, so we're in this menu right now, and we're in sampling, and then we've also unfurled this render option. And right now you can see the max samples is set to 4096 by default. I think that's quite high. If your computer is struggling with performance on the render, if it's taking too long, you can actually lower that quite a bit. And I think it'll still end up looking pretty good. I think it used to be even like 200 by default. And that should, it will make your render look a little bit less realistic, but it should work much faster. You definitely want denoise checked on, but in the latest version of Blender, that's on by default, so that's good. Light paths as well. If your render is taking too long, you can try lowering this total bounces a little bit. Sometimes 8 or even 6 will look pretty good, but let's not mess with that too much. And that's pretty much it. So let's actually set this back to the default size because this is a simple scene. And let's go ahead and click render image. And you can see because I set the resolution a lot higher, it's going to take a second to calculate all this. So you can see there it's calculating the samples, and it's going all the way up to 4096, which we set it to. So that is going to take significantly longer. And it's rendering half and half right now, and it's just going to be the way it works. It's sometimes it'll split it up into small parts, and just kind of have to wait for everything to work out. It will tell you the remaining time in the render, or at least it'll estimate it. So right now we can see we have 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining on this render, which is good to know. And also the time elapsed will be over here. Now at any point, and this is only true of the latest couple versions of Blender, so be careful. So normally you would hit escape if you wanted to cancel a render mid-progress, and that's still true. So, but it'll actually save your current progress if you do that. So let's cancel it just before it finishes. Let's say we're happy with how it's looking right now and we don't need it to like perfectly calculate every other light bounce. And we hit escape and it'll pause right there, you'll see. It'll take a second to denoise, which it always does at the end because we had that little denoising checkbox on. It's calculating that for a second. Give it a second here. And there we go. So we can actually just, image, save this as, and I think it'll look pretty good, at least to take into Photoshop and touch up. Let's say we did this with our palace scene and we wanted to update it more in Photoshop. All we'd have to do is image, save as, and save it to our desktop. That's a really good kind of method if you don't want to wait the entire time for a really nice render. Let's X out of that. And let's talk about a couple other render passes that you probably will want to use. So one trick I like to do, if you're saving this out into Photoshop, you often want something called a clown render. And what that is basically each object having its own flat color assigned to it so that you can make easy selections in Photoshop. So there's a few ways to do it in Blender, but the easiest one I think is if you switch back over to the viewport option, and then you click this tiny little drop down right here, and you get this really great menu for adjusting the way things look just in the regular viewport. And we click flat and then random. And right away, you'll see that assigned a slightly different color to every single object in the scene. You can check on or off this little outline option depending on the situation. It's very thin outline, so I usually just keep it on. And now, instead of clicking render image, that'll make a render with cycles perfectly with all the materials and lighting, which we don't want right now. All we want is to take a little, almost like a high-res screenshot of what we have exactly. So all you have to do is click this view and then viewport render image. And that'll work very quickly because it doesn't have that much to calculate. And you can see if I zoom out that this is the exact pass that we were looking for. So all you have to do is image, save that as, to the same folder. And now you have an option here. And we'll talk about why this is useful in a minute when we get into our actual tutorial workflow, but we just want to make you aware of that option. So let's X out of that. And if you want to get back to the regular gray boxes, you have to go back to Studio and Material, and then you're back to where you were. One more little pass I want to talk about is the mist pass. Let's talk about that really quick. I'm going to adjust the camera view slightly to show this because it works better when there's a lot of depth in your scene. So let's actually select all these cubes and duplicate them along the y-axis so that we have some depth in our scene. And let's angle the camera. There we go. Okay, so to turn on the mist pass, you'll have to go over to this little passes menu. And here's some of the extra passes that we can render out. All we care about right now is this little mist button. Okay, so now if we go into this world option right here, this little mist pass menu option will appear. I don't think it would have been there before if we hadn't checked that on. And if we unfurl that, you see these mist options. So we definitely want to adjust those, but first we have to view the mist. So let's go back into rendered view and then click this little drop down here. Right now we're viewing combined, which is like the perfect lighting that the final render will be. But right now, let's click that and just switch over to the mist pass. And you'll see that we're seeing this gray, black, and white scene, and I can hide overlays if I want. And you can actually adjust the depth here to get that to be stronger mist in the scene or less mist in the scene. And the start is the distance from camera. So usually probably want that pretty low, maybe even 0. And then you can actually switch quadratic to linear for a slightly different effect, and you can decide which one looks better. Let's say generally speaking, you want everything in the scene to be at least a little bit visible, with the things in the foreground to be quite dark. So let's say we're happy with that. All you need to do is render the image like regular. and I'll skip forward to where this is finished. All right, and now that this is finished, we can actually go over here to this drop-down menu where it says Combined, and we can switch over to the mist pass. And this is only here because we checked on that mist pass in the other menu. If we click that, we'll see that we get the mist render that we wanted, and we can save that to our desktop in the same folder. And again, we'll talk about why this is going to be very useful for the Photoshop stage later, but I just wanted to mention how you get that in Blender. All right, that pretty much concludes our little introduction to Blender here. I know that was just a very quick overview of everything that I use it for, and we're going to get into a lot more detail once we do the next section with the step-by-step on how to actually do the Fantasy Palace render. But hopefully this is just enough to get you started. For me, when I first started learning Blender, it was a little bit tricky to find everything that I needed just to get started really quickly, in one tutorial. So that's kind of what I wanted to do here. And there's lots to learn about it. So keep on learning and keep on searching for those answers. There's plenty of free information out there on YouTube. And Gumroad, ArtStation has a lot of great tutorials as well. So let's move on.